Welcome. This is, I don't know how many now, maybe fourth or fifth seminars. It's a pleasure to welcome Chris. Chris Ryder is a Senior Behavioural Scientist within the Ethics, Risk and Compliance Department at Novartis. He specializes in applied behavioral science and applying it to create ethical cultures and experimental ways to drive speak-up behaviors. And I'm sure we'll learn more about what speak-up behaviors are.
You will.
His work has been published multiple times in MIT Sloan, and he was the winner of the ECEC 2022 Project of the Year. So it's a great honor. Thank you, Chris, and look forward to your presentation.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Gail.
I'm going to go back in there.
Run around. So yeah, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today, not just because I live 5 minutes down the road, so it was also very convenient to come here as well. So I'm happy to talk to you about my favorite topics, which are behavioral science and ethics in business. And I guess just a little bit about me. I've not always been working in behavioral science. It's actually a bit of a second career. I originally, going back about 10 years, started out as an undergrad doing philosophy and ethics. And we came out of my undergrad thinking about kind of what's the job market looking like, what jobs are my friends going for, and everyone's going, well, a few of my friends are going into this sort of big bad world of Big Four consulting. So I actually started out my career post-uni at KPMG, working as a risk consultant and trained up as a chartered accountant as well for my sins. And all the time I was working at KPMG and working as a risk consultant, I was thinking to myself, like, is this really getting to the core of what the problems are which we're solving here? Is there a human element to what's going on which is being overlooked in a lot of organizations when it comes to how do you create an organization and set it up to work in the most ethical or risk compliant way? And I'd always been really fascinated by psychology, from just reading a few books on holiday and nothing too serious. And then I came across the world of behavioral science and behavioral economics, and it absolutely blew me away, and I fell in love with it. And I took a bit of what felt like a risk at the time to take a break from my career to go back to university and study. And I went and did a master's at the University of Bath, sorry, not Kingston, the University of Bath in behavioural science. And really pleasingly, at the end of that, because I didn't know where that course was going to take me, I got this job where I'm still at today within Novartis, working in the ethics, risk and compliance function. So in a nutshell, trying to help the organization make more ethical decisions. And for, I guess, background, kind of who are Novartis? What is Novartis? So it's a large pharmaceutical company. It operates in about 100 or so countries, about 100,000 plus employees worldwide. So there's a whole host of people there to try and shape their decision making and help them be their best ethical selves. And so I'm going to take you through today some of the ways we bring behavioral science to shaping our culture and shaping the organization. So I just got to begin with a bit of a mandatory disclaimer slide that although I'm employed by Novartis, everything I say today are my own opinions, and this is me talking, not Novartis. And if you want to take any photos or publish anything from today, just check with me first. Cool, done. So I want to kick us off with a little bit of an icebreaker. So what we've got here is this visual illusion. So you've got this checkered board of light and dark colored squares. And what I'd like you to focus in on are these squares A and B. And I'm going to ask you to do a show of hands in a second to vote on, do you think they're the same color or is one darker than the other? So just start off, who thinks A is the darker square? Cool. Unanimous. I won't even bother asking who thinks B then or the same. So yes, A might look darker, but in truth, they are the same color. And what's happening here is a visual illusion. So this cylinder is casting a shadow over the board, and it's creating this shadow area here, which makes B appear to be lighter compared to square A. And why does this matter? What's the point of this when it comes to ethics? It's really just trying to highlight in a roundabout way that the context matters when it comes to thinking about ethics. That actually it's not just, you can't just look at squares individually or decisions individually or people individually. It's everything around them which shapes the context of that individual decision. And that ultimately makes things look black or white. So just to prove that those are the same color and there's not any funny business going on with PowerPoint, there you go, back there. They just appear to be different in that context. So to set a bit of context for when I start talking about the work that we do, there's a really important insight to know when it comes to ethics. And it's based on lots of research that has been done out there by academia, looking at lots of different experiments, thousands of people, to understand why do some people behave ethically and others unethically? What's the difference here? What causes it? And what they found was that there are this significant but minority of people who fall under the category of white knights, these people with uncompromising integrity that always do the right thing. But that's not everyone. We also then have the infamous bad apples. These are just a very small, slim proportion of people. And these are the people that will cheat and behave, conduct misconduct to the maximum. But it's just a very slim proportion. And the majority of us, we sit in the gray zone. This is where we get shaped by our context, just like those squares a moment ago. And ultimately, it's us in this area here, which is where we can have an impact on organizations in shaping the ethical culture. If you can have everyone in the gray zone behaving ethically, then you've done 99% of the battle. But also, if you set up your organization in a poor way, which might not encourage ethical behavior, but might even tolerate or allow unethical behavior, then you're creating a big problem for yourself, because suddenly over half your employees might be prone to unethical behavior. And why is it that most of us are in this gray zone? Like, what's going on here psychologically? There's this concept called moral licensing. And this is where, as long as we still see ourselves as being a good individual, we allow ourselves to cheat just that little bit. We just push the mark just a small amount. But as long as we still think of ourselves as good people, then we let ourselves off. We give ourselves this license. And I think you might see this across a whole host of areas. It's not just ethics. It might be from environmental practices. So people might recycle at home, but they'll still go on big expensive flights or have a diesel car because they're doing a little bit of green initiatives. They're doing a little something which is beneficial for the environment. That creates them the license to perhaps do something which is a lot worse for the environment, or even for health. We might go for a run or go to the gym, and then we treat ourselves with a pizza or going out for drinks. So we create this license for ourselves. And it's exactly the same when it comes to ethical behavior as well. And this is what's really important in terms of what can organizations do. It's how do we shape this context for the people in the gray zone? So just a bit more background on Novartis and our purpose. Or rather my purpose within the organization of ethics, risk and compliance. So the ethics part is how do we get people to do the right thing, behave ethically? The risk part is thinking about all the different risks that might influence and be a factor in a large pharmaceutical company. So you just imagine all the risks around how do we reach out to patients, to doctors, how do we launch medicines? How do you market medicines? How do you make sure you're behaving responsibly? There's a whole host of risks out there which really matter. And then the compliance part around how do you make sure people are following the policies and the processes internally that they should. And so this, as a sort of high level, is what we try and do in ethics, risk and compliance. And then we I myself and the team I work in, we bring a behavioral science lens to trying to solve these problems. So lastly, for this explaining the bit of the background and the context, and we like to always use this metaphor of the iceberg when it comes to driving ethics. So we've got the top of the iceberg, the visible part. So for many companies, this is like a code of conduct or a code of ethics. It might be your senior leaders talking the talk and saying how they value integrity. You might even have integrity as a company value. I think like 99% of companies have integrity as a company value, but you still have scandals that go on. It doesn't mean that you're going to have ethical behavior by the organization. But it's still, nowadays, it's an important signal to have. So it's still useful to have that top part of the iceberg. But the really important section that has to come as well is the lower part. This is the culture that you have. This is the systems that you set up, the incentives you have in an organization to encourage people to behave the right way, and be careful not to set it up in a way which derails people to behave unethically and do the wrong thing. And so this is how we try and kind of articulate and explain to people how we break down ethics, risk, and compliance into these two different drivers here. So what I'm going to do as I take you through the work that we do at Novartis is take you through these different sections here. So measure, measure, measure. How do we measure culture? How do we measure ethics? How is that even quantifiable? The experimentation part, which is my favorite part, about finding out what works in practice, and then just a brief comment on making sure that you scale what you learn. So measure, measure, measure. And I don't expect you to be able to read everything on the slide, but the gist of it is we designed this whole massive comprehensive survey to measure ethical culture within the organization. So how do we go about doing this? Well, we looked at what academia told us about ethics. See, what are the cultural components which really matter and are most strongly associated with ethical cultures? For example, having a good organizational justice, sense of trust in the organization, sense of fairness, psychological safety, which I'll talk a lot about in a couple of moments, ethical awareness. So there's a whole host of kind of cultural areas which we see from the research in academia are really strongly related to ethical behavior. And then we also ask a series of questions around what do people notice in their sort of day-to-day reality? Had they seen any unethical behavior last year? Did they speak up about it? Who did they speak up to? Did they feel like it was addressed? Did they have a good experience when they spoke up? And what we've then been able to do is look at the massive results from across the survey. So we've had, I think, about 30,000 responses each year that we've run the survey over the last 3 years. And this has given us a massive data pool, which from a kind of social science point of view, and sort of my inner nerd gets really excited by, is just how much data we are then able to look at and analyze to break down and really understand ethical culture, particularly looking at kind of the different countries that we have at Novartis, the different divisions. There's so many subcultures out there. And by having this data, this really helps us to inform where some of the problems might lie. And so what we have here is it's a bit of just a visual depiction of kind of the theory, if you will. This is, you know, what it looks like. We've got the ethical behaviors starting here, and then you've got some more of the cultural constructs that kind of sit all around there, which all in theory drive ethical behavior. And what we ran was this big correlational analysis to see, do these cultural areas, do we find in the data that they actually did relate to ethical behaviors or not? And this is what we found. On the whole, yes. On the whole, most of the constructs that we wanted to measure, what found in academia held true also within Novartis. You can see by the distance that these circles are with one another, the closer they are, the stronger the relationship. Yeah, please.
Just a quick question on the different colours.
Mm-hmm.
Do the different colours signify something?
They signify they're the ones I want you to look at most closely. So the lighter the colour, these are kind of maybe the core pillars, let's say. So ethical behaviours is kind of one of the core pillars. ethical climate is kind of a bit of a broad term that we use to cover kind of a lot of the cultural areas. Interestingly, ethical awareness we found had actually quite a weak relationship with ethical behaviors. And that can almost be a little bit counterintuitive sometimes in the kind of classical way of thinking about ethics, is that, oh, if people are just more aware about ethics, then they'll behave more ethically, right? No, that doesn't seem to be the case. And that kind of shows the disconnect of when you've got that iceberg that I showed you a couple of slides ago, that it's not just about awareness, it's not just about having a code of conduct or a code of ethics and really just trying to throw ethics at people as much as you can. Really, you need the culture, you need the ethical climate around it to support. And that's actually a far bigger driver of ethical behavior in organizations, and where I encourage a lot of people to focus, because sometimes the ethical awareness is the easy part, but it's not going to be as effective. So now I want to focus in on one particular part, psychological safety. And I'll take you through kind of why, but firstly, I'll explain what is psychological safety. So I want you to think about a time where maybe you've been in a meeting or in a classroom and you've had a question. You're not sure what someone's talking about. It's not very clear to you. And you think about, do I raise my hand? Do I ask the question? But you decide not to. You're worried you might look silly. Maybe I should know this. Maybe this will reflect badly on me. And that's the case where you've been in an unpsychologically safe environment. So what psychological safety is, you can see kind of the formal academic definition here. It's this belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up. And it could be speaking up about many things. It could be creativity and innovation. So it could be really good for companies who want to be really innovative and coming up with product ideas and having brainstorms. No such thing as a silly idea. It could be great for diversity and inclusion. And specifically in our case, in kind of ethics, risk and compliance, we really care about it because it relates to speaking up. So people saying, oh, I saw something or I saw my colleague, I saw Gail doing something that didn't feel right. I'm going to report her. I should speak up about that. I'm not just going to sit quietly and let that go. And so one of the things we found was that psychological safety was a big deal when it comes to speaking up. And we found also, though, there was a bit of we call this double jeopardy when it comes to cultures that don't feel psychologically safe. And there's an article about it that I'm happy to share around if anyone is interested after the talk. But essentially, this is what we found in our survey data. So firstly, and I'll sort of talk this through because, again, small words. But firstly, we found this effect between people who felt more psychologically safe and who they would speak to if they were to speak up. So essentially, the more safe someone felt, the more likely they were to go to their compliance officer, go to HR, speak to their manager. But conversely, those who didn't feel safe, they were amongst the most likely people to keep it to themselves, to not speak up. So this really sort of confirmed what we expected to see, is that there is a relationship between psychological safety and speaking up. But, and it's a big but, we also found this massive relationship between the amount of unethical behavior that someone saw and how psychologically safe they felt. So what we've got on the top row here is people saw no unethical behaviors in the last 12 months. They were among the most psychologically safe people. But the more unethical behavior someone saw, the less psychologically safe they would feel. And why this really matters is that the people who are seeing the most unethical behavior are among the least likely people to speak up, despite being the people we need to speak up the most. So it's this real double jeopardy or catch-22 situation that happens here. And this is great. Okay, we've found a big problem, but what can we do about it? And this is where we move beyond measure into experimenting and finding out what works. So how do we create psychological safety? How do we break out of this catch-22? What's that?
Oh, yeah, the bad apple.
If only that's only less than 1%. Got to think about that, the big area of those in the moral grey zone. And there's also an article which I'm happy to share with anyone afterwards that just came out a couple of weeks ago. And so we ran an experiment to find out what can managers do to improve psychological safety in their teams. And we knew that this manager relationship was really important because from our survey data, one of the most common people that someone would speak up to if they wanted to raise a concern was going to their manager. That's what the vast majority of people who spoke up would go to. So we thought, yeah, please.
Just ask where the experiments were held and who with.
Absolutely. So the survey was run globally. This was every employee at Novartis was invited to take part, including externals. So it's about 150,000 people we invited, between 30,000 and 40,000 responses everywhere. Then this experiment, which I'll take you through now, this was a pilot we ran with one section of the organization, one division called Sandoz, and they featured across the globe quite evenly, and there's about, I'll say in a sec, but it's about 7,000 employees, specifically 1,000 managers. So just looking at kind of a slice of the organization to test first what works before you get to the kind of the final step of let's scale this up. And so what we ran in this experiment was to see, can we improve one-to-one meetings that managers have with their employees? And our hypothesis, our guess was that if you can have a more meaningful one-to-one meeting, which is sort of something that we felt that most employees would have on a kind of a regular basis, because that's something when you're designing an experiment, you've got to think about, what's like kind of a common occurrence, which is going to be universal across kind of a whole host of employees, because that's going to be an intervention that you can scale. And so we thought, okay, if we can improve the one-to-one meetings, this perhaps we'll see, might improve psychological safety. And so this is what we did. We ran what's known as a randomized control trial. And so this is where you have, we split everyone into one of three different groups. We had a control group. So in this group, they're told we're doing a study on meeting habits. We didn't even mention the word psychological safety, just a study on meeting habits. And that was kind of all we told them. Then we had our two treatment groups to see if we apply our treatment, is this going to have an effect? And we gave slightly different guidances to managers depending on what treatment they're in. So for the first treatment, we call this one individual needs. So we gave guidance to managers to use the one-to-ones to really actually take a step back, listen to their employees, listen to what they need, let them direct the conversation, and do more listening rather than talking. So that was one group. The other treatment group we call removing blockers. And in this group, we gave managers guidance encouraging them to really use the one-to-ones to focus on prioritization. So talk about with your employee, what work do you want to focus on, what's getting in the way of you doing your work, what really matters to the manager in terms of where that employee should be focusing on their work. And what we were able to do is we had these quarterly company surveys that we do, and we looked at the results from before we ran the experiment to see what's the level of psychological safety across all these teams before we run the experiment. We then had this 6-week period where it was just a simple set of emails, just sending out this guidance, reminding managers, are you conducting your one-to-one meetings? Here's the guidance. Please follow this guidance when you're doing your one-to-ones. And then after 6 weeks, we then had the next quarterly company survey, and we're then able to see have the results changed. Has psychological safety improved across these teams, depending on kind of what treatment we'd given them? And before I reveal the results, let's do another vote, another sort of show of hands, because a little experiment. See, what do you think? What do you think worked the best? So you can do hands up for individual needs. Okay. Hands up for removing blockers. And hands up for nothing worked. And this is just a humbling story of why experiments should be done, but don't always work. Okay, so mostly individual needs. And I'm pleased to say you are exactly right. Individual needs work the best. Moving blockers work too, so don't worry, it's still a good intuition. But individual needs was even more effective. Pleasingly, compared to the control group, individual needs, the psychological safety people in that group increased by about 14% more than the control group over those 6 weeks. Moving blockers increased by about 8% more than the control group. So it's still positive, but it's just not as good. But what got really interesting is where we dove into the data a bit more, and we focused just on those teams who had the lower levels of psychological safety at the beginning of the experiment. And what we found was that the treatments were even more effective for these groups. So what this meant is that the people that needed the help the most to become more psychologically safe, they were the ones that also benefited the most as well. So this is a really pleasing finding for us, in that it gave us that good indication that we're raising the floor when it came to the level of psychological safety in this part of the organization. And then the third and final insight I'll share from this experiment, and my actual favorite one, is that we did find a twist as well. And that when we focused just on the groups that were already on the high level of psychological safety at the start of the experiment, the removing blockers treatment was actually more effective with this group of employees. And so what this told us is that really you have to take this nuanced approach when it comes to running interventions and thinking about what works in organizations, and that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to land always. And really, it makes a lot of sense logically when you think about it as well, that the same thing that might get you from kind of a 2 to 6 level of psychological safety, say, isn't going to be the same thing that will get you from 6 to 9. It's going to take you different types of strategies, different types of interventions. And this is something that came out of the data and what we saw. I guess I'll just pause quickly. Are there any questions about this experiment before I go into a second one? Yeah.
This results to the couple of slides back when we're talking about the double jeopardies, when the people with the higher individual physiological safety actually felt unsafe when they start identifying some odd stuff going on. Are these linked to individual addressing individual needs or removing the blockers?
Great question, and I wish we had the data to be able to answer that. The way that the global ethics survey was run, and then the survey data that we used for this particular experiment were slightly different data sets, and unfortunately there wasn't a way to match them up at a team level. Because I agree, I think that would be really fascinating to know. But when we do the global ethics survey, we have to do it anonymously, so all we really capture is what country people are in and what division they're in, but we don't go any deeper than that. Whereas for this experiment, we said we need to get data at a team level, and so we had to dive a little bit further. But yeah, that'd be a great kind of question to see, can we actually see that relationship? And this probably says a lot about how in companies there is this level of, there's only so much you can measure sometimes, and you have to kind of make some choices about what can you infer, what can you take away logically. Is like, well, if we see X, then Y, and then therefore Z should probably also matter here. But yeah, I would love to see that, but unfortunately, we just have to make some inferences about what this might mean. Yeah.
Did you get a rise in people speaking up in those groups?
Well, this is also where it'd be great to be able to see in the data, but we didn't have a question specifically about, do people raise concerns to their managers? And only a small proportion of people go to their go all the way to the speak up office, who are kind of like the highest level of raising a concern. And so again, we weren't able to see in the data, does this lead directly to speaking up more? But what we did see in because we ran a survey after the experiment to understand, are there differences in types of behavior that people are seeing? And we did see increases in perceptions of people's managers. So people thought their managers were more ethical leaders and better leaders in the organization. They saw an increase in career progression perceptions. So they felt like they had more opportunities because they're having these more meaningful one-to-one meetings. So it definitely, we found this intervention didn't affect only psychological safety, but did have this kind of broader impact across a series of metrics, which makes sense as well, that, you know, not one intervention is only going to, it's not like a knife on culture. It's going to be a broad impact across multiple different areas. Please.
That's a future experiment.
We didn't measure moral licensing either in this experiment. I think that would, again, be something very interesting to try and compare and see how does this impact. And this is where, yeah, unfortunately, you have to be very selective in how many questions we can encourage people to do in surveys. I'm always, keen to try and do as many surveys as possible, but yeah, there's a limit to how many questions. I did it like every day. People could be doing 100 questions for me, but yeah, there's this level of practicality. So great question as well.
Lower hierarchy of the management position taking part in this survey, or only you measure employee manager?
Yeah, so yeah, everyone. So yeah, it's employees and, well, so we're looking at the manager teams, and then but the manager team to manager team to manager team. So the managers would also be included in the survey, but for their manager. So it's kind of this hierarchy of the way we measure this. Cool. So I want to now take you through another experiment. This is a very different one, and this is now more focusing probably on that compliance side. It's kind of a classic behavioral science experiment. So one of the things that we have to do at Novartis and in many large organizations is to declare if you have a conflict of interest. So, for example, do you have a cousin that works for a supplier that you plan on doing business with? Maybe you're in a relationship with your reportee. Maybe you have shares in a company and they're up for a tender. Whatever it is, the first step is encouraging people to declare a conflict of interest so that then you can try and manage it as a business. And one of the kind of behavioral problems that we find is that every year people have to review their conflict of interest position, and not everyone is as timely as they should be when it comes to doing this review. And so what we wanted to see is, can we bring some behavioral insights into how we ask people to perform this conflict of interest review? And I think, and this probably holds true for a lot of different problems in organizations, from getting people to do mandatory trainings, come to workshops, maybe even just come into the office. But this is specifically looking at conflict of interest reviews. And we looked at the existing message that gets sent, and we found that it was just very functional, but lacked a bit of human-centric design. It didn't, we thought there's a lot of scope for bringing some behavioral insights into this. And so this is what we tested. We set up another experiment, this time with 360 odd employees who had these overdue conflict of interest reviews that they had to do. And we randomly set them into one of three message groups to see, did one of these work more than another? So we had the original message that you just saw. Then we also had this loss aversion message, so highlighting the negative consequences for if someone doesn't do their review in time. And then we had this social norms message, so saying, you know, most of your employees have already done this, you're amongst the last. And so this is what they looked like. So we did a bit of reformatting, we brought in a deadline, and then we highlighted, to avoid risk to your personal reputation. So part of the negative consequences, in order to stay compliant. So this idea that you're going to lose your compliance if you don't act now. So that was a loss aversion message. The social norms message, very similar to loss aversion, but different wording around, you're currently among the last associates to review the conflict of interest. We rely on each other to keep our disclosures up to date. So really trying to bring the social element into why they should be doing this. And let's do one last vote, one last see how, as a room, if you can get 3 for 3. What do you think worked best? So hands up for the loss aversion message. Hands up for social norms message. And hands up for the original message worked the best. That one, good. A lot of faith. So this is what we found. The original message. So we gave them 6 weeks, and then we looked at the data again. And after 6 weeks, the original message people, about 32% of them had done their conflict of interest review. Loss aversion, a little bit better, not really, 35%. Nothing that was statistically significant though. And then social norms, 47%, nearly half. So well done everyone that gets social norms. And this was really encouraging because this was both practically and statistically significant as an increase compared to the other message types. And I think it also holds true with some other behavioral science research out there about how powerful social norms can be when it comes to trying to drive behavior. And I know for me personally, I think if I was told I was amongst the last of my peers to do something, I would want to do it pretty quick. So lastly, scale ethics by design. It's all well and good, finding problems, creating behavioral solutions to them that you find works, but you really got to follow it through and make sure you scale them. And also making sure that the things that you do test to work in practice, thinking about all the time, is this something that could be scaled across an organization or not? And so this is where, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but this is where it's also a lot of time and effort has to get spent. And finding the right partners in the business to convince them, using the data that you find when you're experimenting, these are initiatives that do work or don't work. So one last thing, and this is kind of as part of the wrap up, I just want to emphasize how important it is for companies that they do think about ethics and they do drive ethics in their organization. And this is a study which isn't one from Novartis, so not at all related to me, but I think really hammers home the point of how important ethics is. And so there was this research study that was done in New Zealand, and these researchers, they wanted to find out when it came to medicines and drugs, why they were more effective in some patients rather than others. Why was it that some patients would feel more side effects, whereas others would feel great? And they looked at a whole host of factors. They thought, how old are these people, these patients? What gender are they? What education level are they? Have they taken different medicines before? Are they more sensitive when it comes to taking medicines? And interestingly, what they found was none of these factors could explain why medicines were more influential, more effective in some people versus in others. But these researchers, they also looked at the patient's feeling of trust in the pharma industry. And amazingly, they found that the level of trust that a patient had in the pharma industry was a really significant explanatory factor as to how effective the medicines were. And so what this means when it comes to organizations and being ethical and compliant is that it's not just about following the rules because as a company you have to by the regulator so you don't get fined, but really it has a big impact on society as a whole, and particularly in the pharmaceutical industry when it comes to how effective medicines are with patients. And so very much finally now, 3 takeaways for you. The first is I want to encourage everyone in your organization to make sure you measure and experiment to find out what really works in practice. Build that evidence to see what really works, because we know that context matters, and one thing that works in one place might not work somewhere else. So it's really important to measure and experiment. The second key takeaway is that sometimes these simple and cost-effective interventions, they really can have a meaningful impact. Often companies love to do big workshops, big expensive training programs, but actually sometimes it's the small, simple stuff, improving one-to-one meetings, just some simple email guidance, tweaking the wording of an email, that can have just as influential an impact, maybe even a more influential impact, and certainly at a far lower cost. And then finally, I always like to encourage everyone to share what works and what doesn't. So much like what I'm doing here today, there's so much we can learn from each other. And ultimately, every business problem that people come across is a great opportunity to test, learn what works, and share. Because ultimately, if we all share what we learn, then we can help create a more ethical workplace for everyone. So thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to questions.